The Valkyrie Dominion had ruled the stars for 8,000 years, and in all that time, they had never met a species they could not break. They had conquered 17 civilizations across 3 galactic arms and turned billions of alien beings into slaves and workers, and they had done it so many times that conquest had become routine for them. So when their long-range sensors detected a small blue planet orbiting an unremarkable yellow star, they did what they always did. They sent fleet. 300 warships emerged from hyperspace above Earth on a Tuesday morning, and the people of the world looked up at the sky and saw darkness where the sun should have been. Ambassador Kethra was an old Valkyrie with scales that had turned silver from age, and he had delivered the same speech to dozens of species before this one. He stood in the communication chamber of his flagship and activated the broadcast that would reach every screen and radio and device on the planet. Below primitive beings of this world, he began in a voice that carried no emotion. I am Ambassador Kethra of the Valkyrie Dominion, and I come to offer you a choice that is not really a choice at all. You will surrender your planet and submit to genetic cataloging, and your strongest members will be selected for service to the Dominion, and the rest will work in whatever capacity we decide. If you refuse, then your cities will burn and your species will be added to the list of those who chose extinction over submission. You have one planetary rotation to decide. Kethra ended the transmission and turned to his adjutant with what passed for a smile among his kind. How long do you think they will take to surrender? The adjutant asked. They never take the full day. Kethra replied. The primitives always break within hours once they see the fleet. On the planet below, the United Earth Council gathered in emergency session at Orbital Station Prometheus, which hung in low orbit above the Pacific Ocean. Secretary General Elena Vasquez was a woman of 73 years with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much of human cruelty to be frightened by alien threats. She listened to the transmission twice, and then she did something that surprised everyone in the FIDO room. She laughed. Madam Secretary, said the Defense Minister, I fail to see the humor in our situation. They think we will surrender. Vasquez said. They think we will simply give up because they have bigger ships and more weapons. She stood and walked to the window where the alien fleet hung like a metal cloud against the stars. They do not know who we are, she said quietly. They have not read our history. Should we try to negotiate? Asked the Minister of Foreign Affairs. No, Vasquez replied. But we should introduce ourselves properly. She ordered her staff to compile a file, and they worked through the night to create something that no alien civilization had ever received before. It was a complete archive of human history. Every war humanity had ever fought was in that file, and every genocide and every massacre and every act of terrible vengeance that had burned across their world for 10,000 years. The Crusades were there, and the Mongol conquests, and the colonization of the Americas, and the Holocaust, and the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. But the file did not just describe events, it contained names. The names of victims numbered in the millions, and the names of perpetrators, and the names of their descendants, and the punishments that had been visited upon them across generations. There were court records from trials held centuries after crimes were committed, and there were stories of families who had tracked down war criminals across decades and continents. The message that accompanied the file was simple. This is who we are, and this is what we do to those who harm us, and we have very long memories. Ambassador Kethra received the file, and at first he thought it was some kind of mistake. What is this? He asked his adjutant. It appears to be their historical records. Ambassador, why would they send us this? But as Kethra began to read, his confusion turned to something else. He read about the Nuremberg trials, where human leaders had hunted down war criminals and executed them years after their crimes. He read about Simon Wiesenthal, who had spent his entire life tracking Nazi officers and bringing them to justice decades after the war ended. He read about blood feuds in Albania that lasted for generations, with families keeping detailed records of every wrong so that great-grandchildren could avenge great-grandparents. He read about the bombing of Pearl Harbor and the atomic fire that had answered it. His scales, which had been a proud silver, began to pale to a sickly gray. "What manner of species is this?" he whispered. "I do not know." "Ambassador," his adjutant replied with visible unease, "but they appear to keep very detailed records of everyone who has ever harmed them, and they remember everything." Kethra should have listened to the fear growing in his hearts. He should have taken his fleet and returned to Dominion space and reported that this species was different from the others. But he had conquered 17 civilizations, and his pride would not allow him to be intimidated by a collection of old documents. "They think their history will frighten us," he said with forced confidence. "They do not understand that the Valkyrie have been waging war since before their species climbed down from the trees. Open fire on their largest population center and show them what real power looks like." The adjutant hesitated. "Ambassador, are you certain this is wise?" "Do it." The Valkyrie dreadnought positioned itself above Buenos Aires and charged its primary weapon. On orbital station, Prometheus, the defense minister, screamed for Vasquez to authorize a counterattack, but she raised her hand for silence. "We cannot stop them," she said. "Our weapons are not strong enough." "Then what do we do?" Vasquez watched the alien ship glow with terrible energy, and her eyes were not filled with fear. They were filled with something much colder. "We remember," she said. The beam struck Buenos Aires at 3:47 p.m. local time, and 14 million people died in an instant. The city that had stood for centuries was reduced to a crater of glass and ash, and the screams of the dying echoed across every communication channel on. The planet ambassador Kethra watched the destruction from his ship and felt satisfied. "Send them another message," he ordered. "Tell them they have 12 hours to surrender, or we will repeat this demonstration." But the humans did not surrender. Instead, they sent a reply that contained only a single line. "We have recorded the names of every person you just killed, and we have recorded your name, Ambassador Kethra, and we have recorded the name of every officer on every ship in your fleet. We will remember." Kethra laughed at the message and ordered his fleet to continue the bombardment over the next 6 months. The Valkyrie destroyed 12 more cities and killed nearly 200 million humans, and they thought they were winning. They did not understand that with every death humanity was not breaking. Humanity was taking notes, and in the ashes of their civilization, the survivors began to build something new. Not homes, not hospitals, not schools. They built shipyards, and they gave their first warship a name that the Valkyrie would come to fear above all others. They called it the Unforgiven. 50 years had passed since the sky burned above Buenos Aires and the Valkyrie. Dominion had moved on to other conquests. That was what conquerors did after all. They broke a world and took what they wanted, and then they forgot about it because there was always another world to break and another species to enslave. The Dominion's records listed Earth as a pacified territory, with a note that the native population had been reduced to acceptable levels and no longer posed a threat. Ambassador Kethra had retired to a comfortable estate on the Valkyrie homeworld, where he was celebrated as a hero for bringing another primitive species to heal. He had not thought about the humans in decades. That was his mistake. In the darkness between stars where no Valkyrie sensor had ever reached, humanity had been busy. They had not spent 50 years rebuilding their cities or mourning their dead or trying to recover from the devastation. They had spent 50 years preparing the survivors of the bombardment, had scattered to every corner of the solar system and beyond, and they had taken 3 things with them. They took their rage, they took their technology, and they took a list. The list contained every name of every person killed in the Valkyrie attacks, and next to those names were the names of the Valkyrie officers responsible and the ships they served on, and the planets where they had been born. Every child in the human diaspora learned to read from that list. Every school taught the history of the massacres before it taught anything else. Every birthday celebration began with a moment of silence for the dead. And every young human who came of age took an oath that their parents had taken and their grandparents before them. They swore that they would never forget and they would never forgiven. Hollowed-out asteroids and hidden bases on frozen moons. The survivors built things that the galaxy had never seen. They studied the wreckage of Valkyrie weapons that had fallen to Earth, and they learned how they worked, and then they made them better. They captured Valkyrie communication signals and decoded them and learned everything about Dominion fleet movements and defensive positions. They sent spies to Dominion worlds disguised as members of other conquered species, and those spies sent back intelligence for decades, and they built ships. The shipyards were hidden in the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, where 1,000 facilities worked, day and night forging metal and weapons and engines. The first ship took 10 years to complete, and they named it the Unforgiven, after the promise they had made to themselves. The second ship was named Buenos Aires, and the third was named Shanghai, after the second city to burn. By the time 50 years had passed, the human fleet numbered 4,000 vessels, and every single one carried the name of a place. The Valkyrie had destroyed. Admiral Chun Wei-Lin stood on the bridge of the Unforgiven and looked out at the assembled armada. She was 62 years old, and she had been born in a refugee camp on Europa 3 months after her parents fled the burning Earth. Her mother had been pregnant during the bombardment of Sao Paulo and had watched the city die from a fleeing transport ship. Chun had grown up on stories of fire falling from the sky, and she had joined the military at 16 and risen through the ranks with a cold determination that frightened even her own officers. "Status report," she said. "All ships reporting ready, Admiral." Her tactical officer replied, "The fleet is at full strength." "And the enemy?" "Valkyrie intelligence indicates they believe we are still decades away from achieving spacefaring capability, and their patrol routes have not changed in 30 years. Chun allowed herself a small smile that held no warmth. "They forgot about us," she said. "Yes, Admiral. They burned our world and killed our people, and then they simply forgot that we existed." "That appears to be correct." Chun turned to face her crew, and every man and woman on that bridge had the same look in their eyes. They had all grown up with the list. They had all taken the oath. They had all been waiting for this moment their entire lives. "Open a channel to the fleet," Chun ordered. Her voice carried to 4,000 ships and over 2 million personnel, and every single one of them stopped what they were doing to listen. 50 years ago, the Valkyrie came to our world and demanded our surrender," she began. "They expected us to bow down and submit, and when we refused, they murdered 14 million people in Buenos Aires. They thought that would break us. They thought we would give up and accept our place as slaves. They were wrong." Her voice grew harder and colder. "For 50 years, we have worked and planned and built, and we have never stopped thinking about what they did to us. Some species might have tried to negotiate peace, and some might have accepted their defeat and moved on. We are not some species. We are human, and humans do not forget." She paused and let the silence stretch across the fleet. "Today we begin our answer to the Valkyrie Dominion, and will not be a war of conquest because we do not want their worlds. It will not be a war of resources because we do not want their wealth. It will be a war of memory. We are going to teach the galaxy what happens when you harm humanity. We are going to show them that there is no distance far enough, and no time long enough to escape what they did. And we are going to make sure that no species ever forgets the lesson." The fleet jumped into hyperspace and emerged above the first Valkyrie colony world 6 hours later. The colony had no warning. The human ships appeared in their sky like avenging angels, and the colonists looked up in confusion because they had never seen vessels like these before. The attack was swift and brutal, and precise. Human marines landed in the capital city, and they went straight to the Hall of Conquest, where the Valkyrie kept monuments to all the species they had destroyed. They burned it to the ground. Then they went to the Temple of Dominion, where priests praised the glory of Valkyrie supremacy. They burned that too. The colonists fled in terror, and the humans let them go because this was not about killing civilians. This was about sending a message. When the attack was over, the human fleet broadcast a single transmission to every Valkyrie receiver. In the system, it was a file containing 14 million names and a promise. This is only the beginning. Across the Dominion, alarms began to sound, and commanders scrambled to understand what was happening. But by the time they mobilized their response, the human fleet had already jumped to the next target, and the next, and the next. The war humanity had been planning for 50 years had finally begun. The Galactic Council had not met in emergency session for 300 years. The last time had been when the Mindari Collective accidentally created a black hole that threatened to swallow an entire star system, and even that crisis had not caused as much panic as what was happening now. 12 elder species sent their representatives to Nexus Prime, which was a massive station built at the center of the galaxy where disputes between civilizations were supposed to be settled peacefully. The great amphitheater could hold 10,000 beings, but today only the 12 council members sat in their designated seats while holographic displays showed them footage from across the Valkyrie Dominion. "How many worlds have fallen?" asked Counselor Vex of the Mindari Collective. Vex was a being made of living crystal, and light pulsed through their body in patterns that showed emotion and right. Now those patterns were chaotic with confusion and fear. 47 colony worlds in the past 6 months, reported the Council's intelligence chief. The human fleet appears and attacks without warning, and then vanishes before Dominion reinforcements can arrive. "Show us the footage from Valkyrie Prime's outer defenses," said High Arbiter Yen. Yen was the oldest being on the council, and her crystalline form had grown so large over the millennia that she needed a special platform to support her weight. The hologram shifted to show a Valkyrie defense station that had been one of the most heavily armed installations in the galaxy. It was now a field of debris. The humans destroyed this in less than 2 hours, the intelligence chief said. "Our analysts cannot determine how they developed weapons capable of such destruction. They had 50 years, Yen replied. 50 years of rage and focus, and they spent every moment of it preparing for this. But they were primitives, protested Ambassador Velthan, who represented the Dominion on the council. They had barely achieved spaceflight when we contacted them. They are not primitives anymore. Dex observed the hologram, changed again to show the aftermath of a ground assault on a Valkyrie mining world. Human soldiers moved through the streets with terrible efficiency, and the footage showed them walking past cowering civilians without harming them. But when they reached a statue of Ambassador Kethra that had been erected in the town square, they stopped. One soldier placed explosive charges around the base while others stood guard. The statue exploded, and the humans cheered, and then they broadcast a message on every frequency. "This is for Buenos Aires. They do not take prisoners," Dex noted. "But they also do not massacre civilians, and that is unusual for a species seeking revenge." "They are not seeking revenge," Yen said quietly. "They are seeking something else entirely." "What do you mean?" The ancient being's light dimmed to a somber blue. "I have seen this behavior before in species that were nearly destroyed, and it is not about killing as many enemies as possible. It is about making certain that the enemy never forgets what they did. They want the Valkyrie to understand." Ambassador Velthan rose from his seat with fury blazing in his eyes. "This is genocide," he declared. The humans are systematically destroying our civilization, and the Council must intervene. Must we? Asked Counselor Nexara of the Flowing Ones. Nexara was a liquid being contained in a transparent suit, and their voice rippled. Like water over stones. Our charter requires us to protect member species from extinction. Velfin insisted. The humans are clearly attempting to wipe us out. Are they? The hologram shifted again to show population statistics from the attacked worlds. Civilian casualties across 47 worlds, total less than 50,000. Nexara observed. For a fleet of 4,000 ships that is remarkably restrained. They destroyed our infrastructure and our monuments and our military installations. Yes, but not your people. What difference does that make? High Arbiter Yen leaned forward, and her light pulsed with something that might have been sadness. Ambassador, I reviewed your own Dominion's records before this session, and I found some interesting numbers. What numbers? 17 species conquered over 8,000 years, and 4 of those species no longer exist because you exterminated them completely. That was war. So is this. Billions of beings across 3 galactic arms live in slavery under your rule, and you never asked the Council for permission to enslave them. They were conquered in legitimate military action. So were the humans. Velfin's scales flushed with rage. You cannot compare what we did to what they are doing. Why not? Because we are the Velkhori Dominion, and we have ruled this region of space for 8,000 years. And the humans have ruled nothing for 50 years because you burned their world. Theg said. Yet here they are with a fleet that can match your own, and a fury that shows no signs of fading. Will the Council intervene or not? Yen looked at the other 11 members, and one by one they indicated their positions. The Council votes to abstain from this conflict. Yen announced, We will neither aid nor hinder either side. You are leaving us to die. We are leaving you to face the consequences of your actions. Yen replied, Something your species has avoided for 8,000 years. When you attacked Earth, you did not ask our permission, and you did not offer the humans a chance to appeal to the Council. You simply decided that they were primitives who did not matter, and you burned their cities and killed their children. Now they have come to collect the debt, and we will not stand in their way. Velfin stared at the Council in disbelief, and then he stormed out of the amphitheater. The doors sealed behind him, and silence fell over the chamber. Do you think the humans will stop with the Velkhori? Dex asked quietly. I do not know, Yen admitted. But I think we should all be very careful not to give them a reason to add our names to their list. They remember everything, and they never forgive. Across the galaxy, the human fleet continued its relentless advance, and with every world they visited, they left behind the same message. 14 million names, and a promise that the reckoning had only begun. Keth Prime had stood unconquered for 8,000 years. The homeworld of the Velkhori Dominion was protected by 3 rings of orbital defense, platforms that could shatter any fleet foolish enough to approach. Its planetary shield could withstand the combined firepower of every warship in the known galaxy, and its surface was covered with weapons, installations that had never been fired in anger because no enemy had ever gotten close enough to threaten them. 30 billion Velkhori lived on that world, and they had grown up believing they were untouchable. They believed their species was destined to rule the stars forever. They believed that conquest was their right and dominion was their nature. They had never learned to be afraid. Admiral Chen Wei-Lin intended to teach them. The human fleet arrived in the Keth system with 4,000 ships arranged in perfect formation, and the Velkhori sensors screamed warnings across every military installation on the planet. General Kethver stood in the planetary command center and watched the human fleet emerge from hyperspace with growing disbelief. This is impossible, he said. Our intelligence indicated they were decades away from building a fleet this size. Your intelligence was wrong, his adjutant replied. How many ships? 4,000 confirmed, and they are all moving into attack formation. Kethvar was old enough to remember when Ambassador Kethra had returned from Earth 50 years ago with tales of primitive beings who had been easily crushed. He was also smart enough to realize that everything his people believed about humans had been catastrophically incorrect. Open a communication channel, he ordered. Perhaps we can negotiate. The channel opened and Admiral Chun's face appeared on every screen in the command center. She was a small woman by human standards, with gray hair and eyes that held no warmth whatsoever behind her. Bridge of the Unforgiven hummed with activity as human officers prepared for battle. Human Commander Kethvar began. I am General Kethvar of the Velkori Home Defense Force, and I am authorized to discuss terms for ending this conflict. I did not come here to discuss terms. Chum replied. Then why did you accept my communication? Because I wanted you to see my face and remember it. Commander, please let us be reasonable about this situation. Reasonable? Chun's voice did not rise, but something in it made Kethvar's scales go pale. You want me to be reasonable? We can negotiate. A peace that benefits both our species. General, 50 years ago, your people came to our world and murdered 14 million civilians in Buenos Aires alone, and over the following months you killed 200 million more. Did you offer them a chance to be reasonable? That was a different time and different leadership. Ambassador Kethra is still alive and living comfortably on an estate not far from where you are standing. He has never been punished for what he did. He has never even apologized. Kethvar had no answer for that because it was true. I am prepared to offer you significant concessions. He tried. Territory and resources and formal recognition of human sovereignty. I do not want your territory. Then what do you want? Chun leaned forward and the camera focused on her face, and every Velkori watching saw the same thing. Her eyes, not anger, not hatred, something worse, certainty. I want you to understand. She said, I want your entire species to understand what you did to us. We understand that mistakes were made. Mistakes? Chun laughed, and it was the most terrible sound Kethvar had ever heard. You think Buenos Aires was a mistake? You think the systematic extermination of 200 million people was a clerical error? I did not mean to minimize. Let me tell you what I mean, General. Chun reached for something off-screen and held up a small device. This contains a database of 14 million names, and I'm going to read some of them to you. Commander, there is no need. Maria Santos, age 7, and she was in the pediatric ward of Buenos Aires Memorial Hospital when your ships opened fire. She was being treated for a broken arm. Her mother was holding her hand when the ceiling collapsed. Please. David Okonkwo, age 34, and he was a teacher who was reading a story to his students when the sky turned white. The children were 4 years old. They never knew what killed them. Stop. I will not stop. Chun's eyes never left the camera. I will never stop. Elena Vasquez, the Secretary General who tried to warn you what we were, and you dismissed her as a primitive, and she lost 3 grandchildren in Buenos Aires. She lived another 20 years, long enough to see the first ships roll off our assembly lines, long enough to know that we would keep our promise. What promise? That we would never forget, that we would never forgive, that we would find everyone responsible and make them understand what they did. Kethvar's adjutant whispered urgently in his ear. General, our defense platforms are targeting the human fleet, but their ships are not returning targeting. Locks. They are not preparing to attack us. What are they doing? On the screen, Chun smiled, and it was like watching ice crack. We are broadcasting. She said, broadcasting what? The names, all 14 million of them. Every screen and every speaker and every device on your planet is now receiving the list of everyone you killed in Buenos Aires. and we will not stop transmitting until every Valkyrie on Keth Prime has heard every single name. Kethford turned to his adjutant. Can we block the transmission? No, General, and they have somehow bypassed all our security protocols. The broadcast is reaching civilian networks as, well, 30 billion people are hearing this. On the planet below, panic was spreading as the names kept coming. Parents pulled their children away from screens, but the broadcast followed them to their personal devices. Workers stopped in the streets, as speakers they had never noticed began reciting an endless list of the dead, and with each name came a face, a human face, a child's face, an old woman's face, faces full of life and hope and joy that had been extinguished in an instant by Valkyrie. Weapons. Enough. Kefir shouted at the screen. We will surrender and we will give you whatever you want, just stop. I do not want your surrender, Chun replied. Then what in the name of all the stars do you want? I want you to remember. For the rest of your lives, I want every Valkyrie to remember what you did to us. I want you to teach your children about Buenos Aires and Shanghai and São Paulo and every city you burned. I want those names carved into your history so deeply that 1,000 years from now, your descendants will still know what you did. That is what I want. The transmission continued for 14 hours, and when it finally ended, the human fleet had not fired a single shot. But something had changed on Keth Prime. The Valkyrie had conquered 17 species, and never once had they been forced to confront the cost. Now they knew, and they would never forget. 100 years had passed since the sky burned above Buenos Aires. The Valkyrie Dominion no longer existed as a political entity, and the once proud empire had fragmented into a dozen smaller states that spent most of their time arguing with each other. Keth Prime was still inhabited, but it was a changed world. The monuments to conquest had been torn down and replaced with memorials to the species the Valkyrie had destroyed over 8,000 years. Ambassador Kethra had died 30 years ago, but not before being forced to stand trial for crimes against humanity, and his conviction was broadcast across the galaxy. The other species the Valkyrie had enslaved were free now, and most of them had formed their own governments and joined the Galactic Council as independent members, and Earth had been rebuilt. The cities that burned had risen again from the ashes, and new generations had grown up in a world where humans were no longer prey, but predators. The scars remained. Of course, the crater where Buenos Aires once stood had been preserved as a memorial, and no building would ever stand there again. Instead, the ground was covered with black granite that stretched for kilometers in every direction, and carved into that stone were 14 million names. Secretary General Yuki Tanaka stood before the memorial on the 100th anniversary of the attack and looked out at a crowd of millions who had gathered to remember. She was 43 years old, and she had been born on a colony ship that carried refugees from the burning Earth. Her grandmother had survived the destruction of Tokyo and had lived long enough to see the human fleet depart for Valkyrie space. Tanaka had grown up on stories of the war and the vengeance and the terrible price that humanity had paid for survival. Now it was her job to decide what came next. Today we remember, she began, and her voice carried across the memorial through speakers that had been placed at intervals throughout the vast expanse of names. We remember the 14 million who died here in Buenos Aires, and the 200 million who died across Earth in the months that followed. We remember the 50 years of exile when our people scattered across the solar system and beyond, carrying nothing but their grief and their rage. We remember the war that followed and the destruction we brought to the Valkyrie Dominion. She paused and looked down at the granite beneath her feet. But we also remember what that war cost us, not in ships or resources or territory, but in something more important. We spent a century with vengeance in our hearts, and we became something that our ancestors might not have recognized. We became conquerors. We became destroyers. We became the thing we hated. The crowd was silent, and Tanaka could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. The galaxy watches us now, she continued. They have watched us for 100 years, and they have seen what we are capable of when we are wronged. They fear us, and perhaps they should. But fear is not the legacy I want to leave for the generations that come after. Useless. She raised her head and looked out at the sea of faces before her. The Valkyrie attacked us because they believed we were primitives, who did not matter, and they were wrong. We proved them wrong with fire and blood and a fury that lasted for decades. But now the war is over. The Dominion is broken. The guilty have been punished. And we have to decide who we want to be. Do we want to be the species that the galaxy fears above all others? Do we want to be the conquerors who replace the Valkyrie at the top of the food chain? Do we want to spend the next 8,000 years doing to others what was done to us? She shook her head slowly. I do not want that future. I do not want my children to grow up in a galaxy that trembles when human ships appear in their sky. I want something different, something better. I want us to use our strength to protect the weak instead of conquering them. I want us to use our long memories to remember the names of those who suffered not just at Valkyrie hands, but at any hands. I want us to be the species that says never again and means it, not just for ourselves, but for everyone. Above the memorial, a new structure hung in orbit, and it was called Prometheus. Reborn after the station that had watched Buenos Aires burn a century ago. From its hangars, ships departed daily, but they were not warships. They were contact vessels and diplomatic cruisers and relief ships carrying aid to worlds that had been devastated by the collapse of the Dominion. Humanity was joining the galactic community at last, and they were doing it not as conquerors, but as something else. Protectors, perhaps, or guardians, or simply neighbors who happen to have very big guns and very long memories. We will never forget what was done to us. Tanaka said, that is our nature, and we cannot change it even if we wanted to. We will carry the names of the dead with us forever, and we will tell their stories to our children and our children's children. But we can choose what we do with that memory. We can let it poison us and turn us into monsters, or we can let it guide us and make us guardians. I choose to be a guardian. I choose to use our strength to protect those who cannot protect themselves. I choose to build a future where no species ever has to experience what we experienced. And I ask you to make that choice with me. The crowd was silent for a long moment, and then a voice began to speak. It was an old woman standing in the front row, and she was reading from a small screen in her hands. Maria Santos, age 7. Another voice joined her. David Okonkwo, age 34, and then another, Elena Vasquez, age 76. The names spread through the crowd like ripples in water, and soon millions of voices were reading the names of the dead. They read for hours as the sun set over the memorial and the stars came out above, and somewhere in those stars, alien civilizations listened and wondered what humanity would do next. But the humans were not thinking about the future in that moment. They were thinking about the past, and they were keeping their promise. They would never forget. They would never forgive. But they would choose what to do with their memory, and they chose to protect instead of destroy. The galaxy had learned its lesson about humanity, and humanity had learned something about itself, that vengeance was not enough. That rage could not sustain them forever, that the best way to honor the dead was not to create more dead, but to make sure no one else had to die. The war was over. The debt had been paid. And humanity looked up at the stars and saw not enemies to destroy, but a universe full of beings who needed someone to stand between them and the darkness. Someone who would never forget. Someone who would never give up. Someone who would protect them no matter the cost. Humanity had found its purpose, and the galaxy would never be the same.